My parents laughed, actually laughed, sitting in a lawyer's conference room in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as my sister Faye was handed a check representing $6.9 million from our grandfather's estate, and then laughed again, considerably harder, when the attorney slid a single, folded $1 bill across the table toward me. My name is Bryony Sutcliffe, 36 years old, and I want to explain something about my relationship with my grandfather, Augustus Whitlock, before I describe exactly what happened in that conference room, because I think the specific texture of our relationship matters enormously to understanding everything that followed. My grandfather had been, for my entire adult life, the one member of my family who genuinely, consistently understood me. A quiet, patient man who'd spent countless weekends throughout my childhood teaching me chess, discussing books, and in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until considerably later, mentoring me through complicated conversations about money, investing, and long-term financial planning that my own parents had never once shown any interest in discussing with either me or Faye. I want to describe the specific moment in that conference room honestly, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how deliberate my parents' reaction actually was. The attorney, a careful, measured man named Desmond Quartang, read through the will's provisions in a straightforward, professional manner, and when he reached the section allocating $6.9 million to Faye, my mother, Marlene, actually clapped her hands together with genuine delight, while my father, Gordon, leaned over to whisper something to her that made them both laugh. Then Desmond read the provision allocating exactly $1 to me, and no further interest in the estate, and I want to be honest about the specific, humiliating clarity of watching both my parents laugh again, considerably harder this time, at what was, unmistakably, meant to be a joke at my expense. "Well," my father said, still chuckling, "I suppose that's fitting, given how differently you two turned out." I want to explain something about the specific dynamic between Faye and me that I think matters considerably to understanding my parents' reaction. Faye had followed a path our parents considered conventionally successful, a prestigious law degree, a position at a major firm, a lifestyle built around visible, easily legible markers of achievement. I had, by contrast, spent the previous decade working as an independent financial consultant, a career path my parents had never fully respected, frequently describing my work, dismissively, as not a real profession compared to Faye's. I sat in that conference room, holding a single folded dollar bill, absorbing my parents' laughter, and I want to be honest that in that specific moment, I genuinely didn't understand what was actually happening, uncertain whether my grandfather, a man I'd believed loved me deeply and consistently, had somehow shared my parents' apparent assessment of my comparative worth. Desmond, once the reading concluded, asked if he could speak with me privately for a few minutes, a request that struck me, in that raw, humiliated moment, as simply an awkward formality rather than anything significant. What he told me, once we were alone in his office, reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't anticipated at all. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this letter privately, once the will reading concluded," Desmond said, handing me a sealed envelope. "He was very specific that I wait until after the formal reading, and very specific that I not discuss its contents with your parents or your sister." I want to describe reading that letter, sitting alone in Desmond's office, because I think it matters considerably more than anything that had happened in the conference room moments earlier. My grandfather's letter explained something I had genuinely never known. 19 years earlier, when I was 17 years old, he had quietly established a separate, irrevocable trust in my name, funded initially with $50,000, invested specifically in a small technology startup founded by a former colleague of his, a company that, over the following 19 years, had grown into a publicly traded corporation, now worth considerably more than anyone in my family had any idea about. Watched you build a career and a life on your own terms, without ever once needing anyone else's approval to know you were doing something meaningful, my grandfather had written. "I gave you a single dollar in the formal will specifically because I wanted your parents and your sister to believe, for a brief time, that you'd been forgotten. I know that sounds cruel, and I've debated for years whether it was the right choice. But I wanted you to understand something I don't think your parents have ever fully appreciated about you. That your worth was never something that needed to be measured against Faye's, and that the version of success you built entirely on your own terms was, to me, worth considerably more than anything a formal inheritance could represent. I want to be honest about how disoriented I felt reading that letter, holding both genuine, overwhelming grief for a grandfather I missed enormously, and a growing, uncertain understanding that I needed to actually verify the trust's existence before I allowed myself to fully process what he described. I met with Desmond formally the following week, and he confirmed everything my grandfather's letter had described. An irrevocable trust, established 19 years earlier, entirely separate from the formal estate proceedings, currently valued, following the technology company's growth and eventual public offering, at just over $11.2 million. I want to describe the specific, complicated emotions I experienced over the following weeks, because I don't think this story is really about simple, triumphant vindication. I felt genuine relief, understanding that my grandfather's love for me had never actually wavered, regardless of how the formal will reading had appeared. But I also felt a deep, unresolved grief about my parents' reaction in that conference room, understanding that their laughter hadn't been calculated cruelty designed around any actual knowledge of the separate trust, but genuine, unguarded contempt for what they'd believed, in that moment, was my actual worth to our family. I want to tell you about the conversation I eventually had with my parents, roughly 6 weeks after the will reading, once I'd had sufficient time to process everything and decide how I wanted to handle the situation. I didn't tell them about the separate trust immediately. I want to be honest about that choice because I think it matters to understanding what I was actually trying to accomplish. I wanted to understand, first, whether their reaction in that conference room represented a genuine, long-standing assessment of my worth or something they might, given the chance, actually reflect on and regret. I need to understand something, I told them, sitting in their living room. You both laughed, genuinely laughed, watching me receive a single dollar while Faye received nearly $7 million. I need to know if that reaction reflects how you've actually felt about me for years, or if it was simply an unfortunate, in-the-moment reaction you'd want to take back if you could. My mother's response, I want to be honest, wasn't immediately what I might have hoped for. Bryony, you have to understand, Faye's path has simply been easier to be proud of publicly, she said. Law degree, a firm everyone recognizes, a clear trajectory. Your work has always felt harder to explain to people, harder to point to as obvious success. I think that made it easier, in a strange way, to see the will's provisions as somehow confirming something we'd already quietly believed. I want to describe the specific, painful clarity of that admission, understanding that my parents' laughter hadn't been a momentary lapse at all, but the visible surfacing of years of quiet, unexamined comparison between Faye and me, one my grandfather had apparently understood far more clearly than either of my parents ever had. I told them about the separate trust 3 months later, once I'd had sufficient time to fully process my own feelings about the entire situation, watching their expressions shift from the same easy dismissal they'd shown in that conference room into something considerably more complicated, layered with genuine shock, and, I want to be honest, visible discomfort at understanding exactly how thoroughly their public laughter had misjudged the situation. I want to be careful here, because I don't think this story is really about financial vindication, satisfying as that specific irony admittedly felt in the moment. What actually mattered to me, considerably more than the trust's value, was finally understanding, with complete clarity, exactly how my parents had genuinely viewed my worth compared to my sister's. A clarity that, however painful, allowed me to finally stop quietly hopping for a kind of approval I now understood had never actually been available to me on the terms I'd unconsciously been seeking it. I want to tell you what happened with Faye, because I think it matters considerably to understanding how this story actually resolved beyond my parents' reaction. Faye, once she understood the full situation, was genuinely, visibly upset on my behalf, admitting that she'd felt uncomfortable throughout the entire will reading but hadn't known how to address our parents' behavior in the moment. I should have said something right there, she told me. Watching them laugh like that, I knew it was wrong, and I just sat there instead of saying anything. I want to describe where my relationship with my parents currently stands, roughly 2 years after that while reading, because I think authentic resolution matters considerably more than a simple, satisfying narrative of triumphant vindication. We speak considerably less frequently than we once did, and I've made a deliberate decision to maintain clearer boundaries around exactly how much of my own life and choices I share with them. Understanding now, with a clarity I didn't previously have, precisely how much unexamined comparison had been shaping their view of me for years. Faye and I are considerably closer now than we were before that while reading, our relationship no longer quietly shaped by our parents' unspoken comparisons, built instead on a genuine, adult friendship neither of us had fully allowed ourselves to develop while still competing, however unconsciously, for approval that, I now understand clearly, was never actually being distributed fairly to begin with. I think, often, about my grandfather's letter, about a single dollar bill that was never actually meant to represent my worth at all, but a quiet, patient test of exactly how my family would respond to what they believed, in that moment, was my complete exclusion from his estate. I think about how thoroughly that test revealed something my grandfather had apparently understood for years, long before I was ready to fully see it myself. He gave me a single dollar in that conference room. What he actually gave me, over 19 years of quiet, patient investment, was considerably more valuable than any single number could fully represent. The clear, unmistakable confirmation that someone in my family had always seen my actual worth clearly, long before I understood I needed that confirmation at all.